Welcome to our follow-up video about the best Steam games you can play on your Mac, divided by gaming genres. Today we focus on shooters, adventure, puzzles, racing, and indie games. Each of the next titles is playable locally on Mac, either through a native macOS version or through CrossOver and other Wine-based projects. Now let's get to the video. Enjoy! Borderlands 2, a co-op looter shooter where you save the day by turning bandits into confetti and then politely checking their pockets for better guns. You are a vault hunter on a planet called Pandora, bouncing between quests, bosses, and loot explosions that somehow never get old. It is at its best with a buddy, because the jokes land harder and the firefights turn into friendly chaos. Build variety is the secret sauce, since the skill trees let you lean into pure gunplay, weird elemental damage, or abilities that get delightfully out of hand. On Apple Silicon Macs, this is native on macOS, but it is an Intel build, so it runs through Rosetta 2. Cross-platform multiplayer can be messy when versions drift, so co-op works best when everyone is on the same platform and update. In our tests, our M3 Max easily got us 120 frames per second, since the PC minimum spec is ancient and the engine is lightweight. A practical minimum is a base M1 with 8GB, with the caveat that big fights may want slightly lower shadows. Recommended settings: 1080p high, and disable PhysX first if you see stutter. BioShock Infinite is a story-first FPS in the floating city of Columbia, where every firefight feels like it is happening inside a political fever dream. You move through linear chapters, upgrade weapons and powers, and keep going because the game really wants you to see the next big set piece. The vibe is bright and glossy on the surface, and unsettling underneath, which is basically the franchise specialty. A highlight is the combat rhythm of guns plus powers, where you are juggling mobility, cover, and crowd control. On Apple Silicon Macs, treat this as a local wine game, because the old native OS X build is 32-bit and modern macOS will not run it. CrossOver is the go-to, and enabling DXVK is a common performance win. On our M3 Max, while playing at 1080p medium, I got between 100 and 160 FPS, depending on the scene and level. I'd say that the minimum here is an M1 with 16GB, since CrossOver overhead and busy fights can spike memory. Warframe is a free-to-play online co-op action game where you play a space ninja in a biomechanical suit and get very serious about collecting parts. The core loop is missions for loot, loot for upgrades, and upgrades for harder missions, with the occasional detour into fashion, because of course. Combat is all about movement, with wall runs, slides, and abilities that turn rooms into fireworks. It also evolves constantly, so there is usually a new system, event, or shiny thing to chase. On Apple Silicon Macs, this is a local wine situation. Again, we recommend CrossOver, though alternatives like Sikaru Gear work too. Because it is an online game with a launcher, the main friction is often updates and logins, not raw FPS. Since the game has modest requirements and is well optimized, at medium settings and 1080p resolution, our Mac easily got us 100 FPS most of the time, with only occasional dips down to around 70. A practical minimum is a base M1 with 8GB, with the caveat that busy hubs may want you to lower the effects. Metro Exodus is a story-driven survival FPS that trades the usual corridor dread for long, tense road trips across a ruined Russia. You hop between semi-open regions, scavenge parts, craft upgrades, and try to stay quiet when the monsters are nearby, because ammo is basically a luxury currency. The vibe is grim, cold, and weirdly beautiful, especially when the game lets you breathe and watch the landscape slide past from the train. A highlight is the immersion, with a pace that alternates between firefights and slow, anxious exploration. The game is native on macOS, and since its requirements are modest by today's standards, I consistently got between 90 and 130 frames per second at medium settings. So even if you are on a base M1 chip, you should be just fine in terms of performance, provided you are willing to adjust the graphical settings. A sci-fi FPS, where the cure for every problem is sprinting into another gunfight and calling it tactical. You get multiplayer and zombies is the real-time sync because every round becomes a co-op debate about perks, doors, and who is pulling their weight. Gunplay is fast and arcadey, and jumps and slides keep the pace high. Again, this is a native title, so you won't need to apply any wine-based workarounds. The gotchas are ecosystem related, since the macOS version has had compatibility issues with the Windows build, and some users report Workshop Zombies content can crash. Also, we came across a couple of Apple Silicon warning reports about a potential ban after a few minutes online, so treat online play cautiously until you confirm current behavior. The game's not heavy by current standards, and our M3 Max stayed locked at 120 frames per second the entire time. We also tested the game on an M1 MacBook Air with 8GB, and there we got 50 to 60 frames per second. In other words, you can run this on any Apple Silicon Mac and it will run just fine. Outer Wilds is an exploration mystery where you are tossed into a tiny solar system and told politely to figure out what is going on. The core loop is flying to a planet, poking at ruins and physics puzzles, learning one crucial detail, and then using that knowledge to get a little farther next time. It is cozy and eerie at the same time, with a soundtrack that feels like camping at the edge of the universe. The big highlight is that progress is basically pure understanding, not stats or gear or skills. The progression here is you leveling up your own knowledge and perception of the game's universe, which is a lot more exciting than it may sound now. For this reason, if you decide to give it a try, do not look up anything or you'd be actively ruining the game for yourself. Sadly, it's not native for Macs, but it works just fine in CrossOver and Cicero Gear. In my test with CrossOver, we got an average of 100 frames per second, with the caveat that wine layers in certain areas can still hitch. The game's heavily reliant on real-time physics, so using translation layers can potentially make it behave weirdly at times, though I didn't notice anything problematic in my testing. Here, I'd recommend an M1 with 16 GB as a practical minimum. 8 gigs may still work, but with more graphical and performance compromises. I also recommend capping your FPS at 60 if you notice any weirdness. The modern Tomb Raider trilogy is cinematic third-person action adventure, where Lara Croft goes from desperate survivor to unstoppable problem solver with a bow. You explore ruins, climb everything that looks even slightly climbable, solve light puzzles, and get pulled into firefights that arrive at the worst moments. The vibe shifts across the 3 games, but the core is always adventure with a side of danger and that classic thrill of finding something ancient. Highlights are the set pieces and the momentum, because these games keep moving and rarely let you get bored. All 3 have native macOS ports and work great on modern Macs. On our M3 Macs at 1080p medium, I hit between 70 and 120 FPS in different areas while playing Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is the latest and heaviest of the 3. To be certain all 3 of the games work well for you, I recommend an M1 with 16 gigs. 8 gigs will probably get the job done too, but you'll have to lower the graphics quite aggressively. My recommended settings: stick to 1080p and disable TresFX first if performance dips. Night in the Woods is a narrative adventure about coming home, talking to everyone you have ever known, and realizing the side quest is your own life falling apart. You play as May, drifting through a small town, checking in with friends, poking at old memories, and slowly uncovering that something is very wrong under the cozy surface. The core loop is exploration and conversations, with occasional small mini-games, so it is more about mood and character than mechanics. The vibe is funny, melancholy, and painfully relatable in that way only indie games dare to be. Highlights are the writing and the soundtrack, plus the way it captures the weirdness of returning to a place that stayed the same while you changed. The game's native for Macs, and since it's a 2D adventure with very lightweight requirements, any Mac released in the past 15 years should easily run it. Red Dead Redemption 2, an open-world western where you spend half your time riding to trouble and the other half looting it, slowly, with great cinematic sincerity. You ride out for missions, hunt, rob, gamble, or just wander until the game distracts you with a sunset that feels expensive. The core loop is story chapters plus free-roam chores, and somehow the chores are the point, because the world is built to be inhabited. A highlight is the atmosphere, from muddy towns to snowy mountains, and the way simple travel feels like an event. On Apple Silicon Macs, this is not native, so the realistic route is local wine, with CrossOver being our first recommendation. Be prepared for some launcher and login friction, because Rockstar ecosystems can be the hardest boss. But once you get to the game itself, it works surprisingly well, provided you have the hardware to support it. Yeah, this is one of the heaviest titles on this list, and on our M3 Max chip, it ran at 45 to 70 frames per second using medium settings. An M2 Pro with 16 GB is the realistic minimum, but since this is a graphically demanding game, any extra unified memory your Mac may have is welcome here. For most Macs, I recommend sticking to 1080p medium and dropping volumetric lighting and shadows if you need headroom. Stray is an adventure game where you play as a cat in a neon-soaked city of robots, and the main objective is exploring, solving light puzzles, and being quietly judgmental. You sneak through alleys, hop across rooftops, collect little memories, and occasionally run for your life when something decides you look snack-sized. The vibe is cozy cyberpunk, with equal parts cute and eerie, and it does a great job of making the world feel lived in. A highlight is the environmental storytelling, because the city sells its history without needing constant exposition. On Apple Silicon Macs, Stray is native and explicitly requires an Apple processor, with macOS 13 Ventura listed on the Steam macOS requirements. So there is no workaround drama here, it is just install and play as long as your Mac is Apple Silicon. At medium settings, our Mac managed between 90 to 140 frames per second, and on a high settings preset, we got around 70 frames per second on average. The game will technically run on a base M1 chip with 8 gigs, but I can't really recommend that because both performance and graphics will be pretty low, not to mention the situation with thermals. The Witness is a first-person puzzle vacation where you solve line panels until your brain starts negotiating with geometry. You wake up on a bright, silent island, and the game basically dares you to notice things you've been ignoring your whole life. Most of what you do is walk, spot a rule, and then immediately get humbled by the next panel that adds one tiny wrinkle. The aha moments hit hard because nothing is explained in words. The island is the tutorial, and it's smug about it. But what really impressed me were the layered rules, the way the environment becomes part of the puzzle language, and the sheer audacity of letting you be lost on purpose. On Apple Silicon Macs, it's native and runs through Rosetta 2, and it's one of those rare games that feels totally at home on Mac. At our usual testing preset of 1080p resolution and medium settings, our Mac easily managed 120 FPS, as this is a pretty light game that should run flawlessly on pretty much anything. In other words, if you have an Apple Silicon Mac, regardless of model, you can run this game at high graphics and with great performance. The Talos Principle is a first-person puzzler wrapped in sci-fi philosophy, like someone hid a logic exam inside a beautiful ruin. You're dropped into serene, ancient-looking test areas, and a disembodied voice keeps insisting you should totally trust it. The core loop is classic. Block lasers, jam turrets, place jammers, carry boxes, and slowly assemble a mental model of the rule set. Then the game starts asking bigger questions about consciousness and meaning right between puzzles that make you pace in circles. The vibe is calm and contemplative, until you're on attempt number 12 and the calm becomes personal. The game's native for Macs, but there are reports of odd performance behavior on some setups, so it's not always perfectly consistent. In our tests, the game worked just fine. Obviously, the medium settings we normally use for testing gave us flawless performance, but even when we cranked everything to max, performance didn't nudge. So yeah, this is one more title you can play on any Apple Silicon chip without worrying about specs. Portal 2 is a puzzle game disguised as a comedy show, and somehow it sticks the landing on both. You're armed with a portal gun and a deeply unhelpful sense of physics, and you solve rooms by turning walls into doorways. The loop is pure experimentation. Shoot 2 portals, fling yourself, redirect lasers, and accidentally drop a cube on something important. The writing is the secret sauce because every new mechanic comes with a perfectly timed line that makes you forget you're stuck. Co-op is a whole second campaign of chaos, and it's one of the best 2 brains, 1 disaster modes ever made. On Apple Silicon Macs, the modern way to play is locally through CrossOver, and it's generally very playable, with a few visual oddities around portals and occasional stutter. Tip for CrossOver: keep it on a recent CrossOver build, and don't be afraid to cap to 60 frames per second if you notice hitching during portal-heavy scenes. There's just no point in talking about performance here, as this is a pretty old game with very, very low requirements. Any hiccups you may face here won't be because of your Mac, but because of translation layer quirks, but those are a given with wine-based methods, and also pretty rare for Portal 2. Human Fall Flat is a physics puzzle platformer where you control a wobbly little guy who moves like he's made of warm cheese. Each level is a toy box of ramps, levers, doors, and objects that can absolutely be used wrong, and the game encourages it. The core loop is grabbing, climbing, dragging, and occasionally face-planting your way into the solution. It's at its best when you play with friends, because every puzzle becomes a teamwork exercise in miscommunication. The vibe is goofy and low stakes, but it still sneaks in clever spatial puzzles under all the slapstick. This is another native macOS title, and it's the kind of game that just works without drama. It's also super lightweight, so again, even the weakest Apple Silicon chip will run it with no difficulty. Still, if the physics chaos starts feeling jittery, I recommend dropping shadows 1 notch and it should all return to normal. Return of the Obra Dinn is a detective puzzle game where your main hobby is politely ruining a ship's entire crew roster. You step onto an abandoned 1800s merchant ship with a magic pocket watch that replays the moment someone died. The loop is pure deduction. Listen, look, cross-reference faces and jobs, and lock in fates until the game confirms you're right. It's not about reflexes, but about noticing tiny details, like accents, uniforms, and who's holding what during a disaster. The monochrome art style is weird in the best way, and the soundtrack makes every reveal feel like you earned it. The game's macOS native and can basically run on a toaster, so any Apple Silicon chip should have no problem running it. Really, the real bottleneck here isn't your Mac's specs, but your brain filing cabinet. Assetto Corsa Competizione is a serious GT racing sim that wants you to care about tire temps, braking points, and your own mistakes. You'll spend your time learning tracks, tuning setups, and chasing consistency, because lap time is a harsh but fair teacher. The handling is the headline, with weighty cars that punish sloppy inputs and reward smooth, boring competence. The vibe is professional motorsport, right down to the audio that makes you believe in engines again. On Apple Silicon Macs, this one is not native, but it can run locally through CrossOver, and it can perform surprisingly well. There are also reports of a nasty bug on some tracks, where racing with opponents can cause the session to stop, so it's playable, but not always reliably raceable. Tip for CrossOver: use D3D Metal, and if you hit the opponent bug, test in solo practice or time trial where it's less likely to ruin your day. Using medium settings and playing through CrossOver, we got between 90 and 130 frames per second, which is more than ideal for anything played through a translation layer. The practical minimum here would be an M1 Pro with 16 gigabytes, because ACC loves both GPU and memory when grids get busy. Translation layer. The practical minimum here would be an M1 Pro with 16 gigabytes, because ACC loves both GPU and memory when grids get busy. Sonic Racing Crossworlds. It's an arcade kart racer where Lap 2 can dump you into a different track, because normal racing apparently wasn't chaotic enough. You pick a Sonic crew, tune a vehicle, and bring gadgets, then drift and boost through loud, fast races. The travel rings gimmick is simple and evil. You race one course, hit the ring, and the next lap happens somewhere else. On Apple Silicon, it's not native, but CrossOver works very well here. It's a DirectX 12 Unreal Engine game, and some players report an AVX-required launch error, so compatibility can sometimes be finicky, though I had no problem running the game on our M3 MacBook Pro. If DX12 acts up, try forcing DirectX 11 with the Steam launch option -D3D11. On our Mac, we got around 60 to 90 frames per second at 1080p media. Need for Speed Heat is an arcade open-world street racer with a split personality, chill daylight racing, and sweaty night runs with angry cops. By day, you earn money. By night, you earn reputation, and the game constantly asks how much risk you're willing to carry back to the garage. The driving leans flashy and aggressive, with big drifts, fast recoveries, and a ton of customization that invites bad decisions. The best moments are the night chases, when the heat level climbs and every shortcut becomes a life choice. On Apple Silicon Macs, it's not native, so you're looking at a local CrossOver setup, and people are actively running it that way on higher-end Apple Silicon. Launchers can be the fragile part of the experience with games like this, so expect occasional, "why are you like this" energy before it settles. Tip for CrossOver: budget time for the first time setup, then lock the game to a stable frame rate and keep reflections reasonable to smooth out stutter. In my testing with the medium preset, our MacBook Pro managed around 60 frames per second, with variability depending on city density, effects, and how wild the chase gets. An M1 Pro with 16 gigs could be seen as a minimum here, but 24 gigs is where you really start to appreciate the game's visuals without compromising performance. SnowRunner is an off-road truck sim where you heroically deliver one plank of wood by suffering in mud for 3 hours. You pick contracts, choose a truck, attach the right trailer, and then crawl across terrain that actively wants you to lose your dignity. The loop is slow on purpose, scouting routes, winching out of disasters, hauling cargo, and slowly upgrading into better tires that feel like divine intervention. The vibe is weirdly relaxing, right up until you tip a truck in a river and realize you live here now. It's also a fantastic podcast game, because half the joy is the steady rhythm of problem solving. On Apple Silicon Macs, it has a Mac version and runs great on most Apple Silicon models as its requirements are pretty tame. Our MacBook Pro averaged around 90 frames per second, and based on the testing results, I'd say an M1 Pro with 16 gigs should be a good practical minimum. For most Macs, I recommend 1080p medium and only lower shadows if performance starts to dip during storms and heavy foliage. Asphalt Legends Unite is a free-to-play arcade racer that proudly believes every corner should be taken sideways and at maximum volume. You jump into short races, hit nitro, pull off ridiculous drifts, and collect a garage full of supercars like you're building a shiny digital museum. The core loop is quick progression. Unlock, upgrade, repeat, then take it online for fast multiplayer chaos. It's flashy, simple to pick up, and absolutely not pretending to be a sim, which is honestly refreshing. As for compatibility, there is a version of the game on the App Store, but here we are talking about the Steam Asphalt Legends, which isn't macOS native, but can be played through CrossOver. Based on user reports and my own testing, I can say the game runs very well through CrossOver, which is honestly surprising for a multiplayer title. It's also not too demanding, so our M3 Max chip easily got us around 80 frames per second as long as I didn't go into the higher settings preset, where the frame rate dropped down to around 50. To consistently run it with good performance, you'll need 16 gigs on an M1 Pro chip or better, and I also recommend turning off motion blur. Hollow Knight is a gloomy, gorgeous Metroidvania where your main hobby is exploring ancient ruins and getting politely murdered for it. You're a tiny bug knight poking through hollowness, mapping new zones, cracking shortcuts, and turning every boss loss into, "okay, but I learned one thing this time." The vibe is quiet and melancholy until it suddenly isn't, and you're juggling spikes, projectiles, and your own stubborn pride. Highlights are the hand-drawn art and that elastic sense of discovery, plus boss fights that feel tough but fair once your hands catch up to your brain. On Apple Silicon Macs, it's a native macOS release, and community tracking also flags it as running perfectly through Rosetta, so either way, it's an easy install and go. On an M3 Max MacBook Pro with 36GB at 1080p medium, I easily got locked 60 frames per second most of the time because the requirements are modest and the game is mostly 2D. A practical minimum is an M1 Mac with 8GB, and it should still feel smooth. And if you like this game, I strongly recommend playing Hollow Knight Silksong, the recently released sequel, which is just as good, if not better. Cult of the Lamb is an action roguelike glued to a cute little cult management sim, and it's oddly charming about the whole adorable Doom thing. You go on dungeon crusades for resources, then come home to build up your camp, recruit followers, and keep everyone fed and loyal. The loop is half hack and slash, half tiny town drama, and it's dangerously good at just one more run. Highlights are the punchy combat and the base building decisions, where every upgrade feels like it immediately changes your day-to-day. On Apple Silicon, this one is native, and it's widely reported as running extremely well. I can confirm that the game plays great on Apple Silicon, and since it's a super lightweight title, any M chip will run it with no issue. Dredge is a cozy fishing adventure that quietly turns into maritime horror, which is a surprisingly effective genre combo for anyone who enjoys relaxing while being mildly cursed. The loop is simple and sticky. Sail out, dredge up fish and trinkets, upgrade your boat, and push your luck as the sun goes down and the ocean starts acting suspicious. Highlights are the atmosphere and progression, because every new gadget makes the map feel bigger, and every night run feels like you're choosing stress on purpose. On Apple Silicon Macs, it's a native macOS release, and Steam even lists Apple M1 in both minimum and recommended requirements, so it's clearly meant to be here. The main quirk here is controller weirdness, where inputs can randomly stop responding, so keep a mouse nearby just in case. On an M3 Max with 36GB at 1080p medium, my FPS rate ranged from 60 to 120, depending on the scene, but it mostly stayed around 100. In other words, this is another game that's not particularly demanding, so a practical minimum is an M1 Mac with 8 gigs. Vampire Survivors is a tiny roguelite where you mostly walk in circles while the screen turns into a fireworks factory that hates you. You pick a character, survive wave after wave, and build a ridiculous loadout by vacuuming gems and evolving weapons until you can't see your own sprite anymore. The vibe is pure dopamine and bad decisions, and the highlight is how it turns 5 minutes into 40 without asking permission. It's also the rare game where strategy can mean stand still and become a lawnmower. On Apple Silicon Macs, it's on macOS through Steam, and though I still can't tell you whether it's fully native or running via Rosetta, the game is so lightweight that the distinction mostly matters for nerd trivia. In my tests, our M3 Max got me a consistent locked 60 frames per second, with the only dips happening when the late game particle soup got out of hand. Once again, you don't need anything more than a base M1 chip to run it without any issues. Undertale is an indie RPG that looks simple, then immediately starts messing with your expectations, your save file habits, and your moral confidence. The core loop is exploring, talking, and doing little bullet hell dodges in battles, except you can often win by not fighting, which turns every encounter into a tiny social puzzle. The highlight is the writing and music, because it can be genuinely funny, genuinely sad, and somehow both at once, often within the same minute. On Apple Silicon Macs, it's available on Steam for macOS, and since it's a 2D pixel graphics game, you just don't need to worry about performance, no matter what Mac you're on. So this was our second list of picks for some of the best Steam games you can play on your Mac. In case you missed our first video on the same topic, it should appear on your screen right about now, so be sure to check it out for more great Steam titles. If you want more similar lists or want us to cover some other Mac gaming topics, leave us a comment. And while you are at it, like this video and subscribe to our channel to support us and never miss any of our videos. Take care until next time.